The mothers of soldiers who die for Russia in Ukraine asked to meet Putin, but when the government organized a group of pro-Kremlin functionaries to meet the president instead, the anger only intensified. The problem is growing and it won't go away. This is Russia Tomorrow. I'm Ekaterina Katrikadze. TV Rain has changed its logo, the symbol you see in the bottom right corner of your screen. A change we made in support of Russia's LGBTQ community. Russia's Federation Council approved a packet of new legislation that prohibits spreading information about sexual minorities. The so-called LGBT propaganda law that was previously targeted at children will now punish anyone who dares to speak publicly about the topic in a positive way. We at TV Rain strongly oppose this new discriminatory law. Putin gives grieving mothers two options for their sons' deaths: fight for a cause and die in a war, or drink vodka in a village and die in a car crash. The Russian president says the first option is better. The EU has already agreed to stop buying Russian oil next month, but is still looking for common ground on a price cap for the rest of the world. What will happen to the price of energy on December 5th? Stalinism, Nazism, fascism and homophobia. The Russian president uses them all to create totalitarianism that is changing society from within. TV Rain has started broadcasting in English so that you could get news about Russia, the war in Ukraine, and Russian society directly from the source.
Russia's military is unable to stop Ukrainian forces.
The Kremlin's newest propaganda target is now the LGBT community.
TV Rain channel has been shut down in Russia many times. The last one happened at the beginning of March, when the war started.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We survived, started working from Europe, and now we are watched by millions of people every day, for whom we are the only TV station that tells the truth about the war. Subscribe to our English channel TV Rain Newsroom on YouTube. Vladimir Putin's least developed quality is his ability to demonstrate human empathy. Not only is he unable to show compassion, he has no talent for faking it. He can't find the right words. He has no pity for others. And so, having sent hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens into battle, this week he met with mothers who are either expecting to receive a message that their son has died or have already found out.
Мой сын Пшеничкин Константин в одном из утренних боев, защищая город, погиб.
Yet this is no cause for worry. The military commander-in-chief wasn't just meeting with any mothers. He was meeting with the right mothers, verified mothers, state employees, functionaries of the All Russia People's Front, and activists for pro-Kremlin organizations.
Specially selected mothers of soldiers. The women Putin met with turned out to be employees and officials of the ONF and other pro-government movements.
And so even a mother in grief who has lost her son and does not hold back her tears has no doubts about the need to kill Ukrainians.
Он выскочил из окопа, вызвал огонь на себя, и последние его слова были: «Пойдем, братва, рубить укропов».
Smugly drinking tea, the president talks about the frailty of life. We're all mortal, we all die. And what's important, after all, is how a life is lived, says the elderly person who has lived a long and eventful life, spending his entire COVID lockdown in a bunker without so much as even his own cabinet ministers allowed within arm's reach. Remember that famously long table? Well, now what do? The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. But in this case, he who taketh away was in fact Vladimir Putin.
Конечно, это огромная трагедия, это пустота, которую ничем не заполнить. Вы сейчас об этом так очень убедительно, ярко сказали. Когда нет близкого человека, тем более сына. Но...
But what? But the president of the Russian Federation decided to take away this unfortunate woman's loved one. I don't know where the limit of hypocrisy in the Putin system is, but This conversation seems to be close to that edge. It is touching that the organizer of a criminal war in a neighboring state uses such words as mother and her boy, portraying a familiarity with the topic of family. But he only ever saw these boys in both the literal and the figurative sense as bodies in coffins. The mothers of the mobilized who really had questions for the president didn't even get an invitation to the Vladimir Putin's residence.
We came to him ourselves, publicly saying that we don't have the answers to many of our questions, and suddenly they begin to meet with someone else. We would like to and are ready to start a dialogue, but for some reason they are not inviting us real people in.
It seems to me that Vladimir Putin is a terribly unhappy person. Well, what pleases him? What does he find enjoyable? How does he spend his free time? I'm afraid that in pursuit of world domination under the protection of endless security officers locked in an armored office, he is deprived of understanding the meaning of life. In his view, you will either die from vodka or in a war. And for the common people, the second option is absolutely perfect.
Вопрос в том, как мы жили. Некоторые ведь живут или не живут непонятно, и как уходят от водки там или еще от чего-то. Непонятно. А потом ушли, жили и не жили. Тоже не, и незаметно пролистнулось как-то. То ли жил человек, то ли нет. А ваш сын жил.
The president of Russia is not aware that there are a million other versions of a happy life between alcoholism and war. He hasn't seen them, he hasn't tried them himself, and his opinion about the people he leads seems most unflattering.
А зачем нам такой мир, если там не будет России?
Vladimir Putin never wanted to meet the military mothers, not even the safe ones. For him, it's a waste of time, bad acting. And there was no talk about supporting the soldiers because, well, why protect those who, in theory, must inevitably drink themselves to death, in extreme cases die in a car crash? And it is not without reason that on social networks, even for the posts by pro-Kremlin media, there are an endless number of curses against the leader of the nation. And the commander-in-chief gets no help either when local officials hand over towel sets and postcards to mothers of dead soldiers. You get the impression that a person can accept and is ready to accept the death of a loved one just by deceiving herself with propaganda, but not everyone. There are more and more women, mothers and wives in Russia who are starting to talk and even protest. And so naturally, the repression intensifies. What is the outcome? Perhaps Putin's greatest fear comes from the unknown power of these women and their grief. A Ukrainian advisor to President Zelensky last month predicted that it is in fact a women's rebellion in Russia that scares Putin the most. With more on the power of a women's movement in Russia, we now turn to Russian journalist and curator Anna Narinskaya. Anna, good to see you on TV Rain. And I need to tell my viewers right now that we are friends, so we know each other for a long time. The first thing that I was wondering about is the power of women in Russia. Do you think that it can change anything? And do you see any new wave of the protest from the mothers, wives, sisters, and so on?
First of all, I should say that, the first thing I should say that there were lots of discussions on why mothers in Russia, they're silent. And it was mostly not about women in general, but about mothers. And which I think is really unfair because nobody is asking why fathers are, not doing anything about their kids, their sons going to the war to kill and to be killed, So it's still kind of this very special attitudes towards women, that's women, being in that position because, as you know, Katya, the position of women in Russia is always been and now is even more vulnerable. The domestic violence is still legal in Russia. So women been oppressed for lots of women. They've been oppressed in Russian Empire and in other way, not visible maybe way, but that's a long thing to discuss. But still, I'm positive they've been oppressed in Soviet Union. Now they're oppressed in Russia. So of course, it's really hard for this human being not able to raise her voice for such a long time, to raise her voice now in such a spooky, I would say, such a dangerous situation. But still, there are women protests. Maybe not this enormous women protest we all wish for, like all the women of Russia, all the mothers of Russia, okay, say mothers, they stand up and they protest against the war, because women are, always more for peace.
Yeah.
Men. Yes, but there are different splashes of protest in different places. And I'm very sad that lots of, I would say, us liberals, we are not appreciating what's going on, because I believe several weeks ago, there was a sort of big, I wouldn't call it uprising, but some sort of noise produced by women who were very unhappy because their kids were sent to Ukraine with no equipment, with not enough warm clothes, that they didn't have even a place to sleep. And I heard and I've seen on social media those discussions saying this is like Jews in Auschwitz would protest against, not good enough gas. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I feel, that's so incredibly hypocritical and so like, even those protests, I feel very important. Something is changing, I think, among young women. Like women of their 20s, they say there are all other issues, the issues of feminism, the issues of even in these horrible circumstances of the absolute oppression.
I would like to ask you about, in more details, if you don't mind, Anya, about these women you have mentioned. They are protesting the circumstances in which their sons and husbands are right now. They are asking for more, accommodation, for ammunition, for money that should be spent on the soldiers and for the soldiers by the government, by the state. So why do you think, I just want to make it clear for the viewers, because it may be unclear, why do these women protest about things that are not connected to the murder of Ukrainians, right? This is what you were talking about, that some of us may not understand. And what's the reason they don't acknowledge that there are, war crimes committed by Russia right now?
Okay. First of all, I want to remind you about the protests against Vietnam War in the USA, where the major protests were not about, killings of Vietnamese people, actually peaceful Vietnamese people, but against American soldiers being killed in Vietnam. I don't think we have time enough to discuss the psychological
motivation
areas of why people, don't have this pacifistic, and why these women are far more worried about their own sons and husbands, but not about the people in another country, about whom those people, these women, were brainwashed by Russian propaganda that they are Nazis. But those protests are the first step to understanding this government and this regime and this power, they are not protecting even their own people. They are only protecting themselves. What do we want? Do we want like the philosophical and really pacifistic agenda? Are we worried about this thing, or we're worried about something to change? I want to ask you.
No. If it comes to me, I understand perfectly well what is going on. I would like to go to the meeting of Vladimir Putin with this woman, with the so-called mothers. I'm saying so-called because they were representing the governmental organizations, and they were very much the mothers, loyal, and so on and so forth. But still, they have kids. They have sons. Some of them had sons because some of them lost their sons on the front in Ukraine. So we saw how Putin was talking to them. We saw the answers of the women, and even their invitation to the Kremlin. They were watching, the beautiful interior of the Kremlin and praising this, and even singing, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is something ridiculous, I would say, and astonishing. But one more thing has happened after this meeting. I've read hundreds of comments in social media of different people, Russians, saying that this is not normal, cursing Putin and this woman, mostly Putin, of course. So do you think that this conversation of the president with this woman was a wrong step for Kremlin itself, for Vladimir Putin? Was this a mistake, in your opinion?
We all think, that Vladimir Putin lives in his specific world, maybe even invented by himself. So in this kind of system in which he exists, there is a tradition in which the most important person in the state, the Tsar, or the leader of the Communist Party, whatever, speaks to women and says, "I feel your pain." And I've been traveling, so I didn't watch the meeting, but I read the kind of the protocol. And he was telling them that, we all gonna die. And so it's not a big difference when you die, earlier for the fighting for the good cause, or you die, from vodka when you are old, which is, I find absolutely appalling. But I believe that is in his own system. He's doing the traditionally right thing, which should be done by the head of the state in such a thing. As you remember, he met the mothers of the Kursk submarine and wives. So that's what he does. And I don't think that in a situation like now, it's important for the Kremlin. The reaction of the people is important at all. I don't think that they bothered about that. As soon as reaction is on the internet, but not on the streets.
Anya, the last thing I would like to ask you about is the prospect of this first steps, as you have mentioned them. The first voices that we can hear, no matter what the motivation is, but, we can see that there are women who are, brave enough to say something. Does this lead to something bigger, in your opinion?
For me, it's emotionally and personally hard to predict, because maybe you remember that 4 years ago, me and my friends made this action which called the Mothers' March, and we were marching and protesting against the legal actions against teenagers, and teenagers being taken to courts for actually, talking to each other, or for thinking the wrong stuff, the stuff which regime doesn't like. But now, I wouldn't have guts. Me personally, I wouldn't have strengths. The punishment, not the punishment, but the aggression against any protesters is incredible. The aggression and things which could happen to not only you, but your relatives, your friends, people who worked with you. So it's like you have every person who is ready to protest should understand that the regime got hostages. And I'm not saying that being silent, that it is an excuse to be silent. But I understand that people who want to protest, they should overcome this fear and this real danger. And this fear not only about yourself, but about your family. So I don't want to predict anything. I should only say that if it happens, I would admire those people very much.
Anna, thank you. Thank you, really. And I admire your honesty, actually, and what you did before and what we all will do, I hope, in the near future. So thank you very much. Anna Narinskaya was on air, incredible person.
Russia tomorrow.
Combat activity across Ukraine continues every day, and all signs point to a second mobilization in Russia after the new year. Even after Putin declared the first mobilization over and done, many more soldiers were still being called up for duty. But now, at the end of November, Ukraine is wet and muddy, and both sides of the conflict line are waiting for a deep winter freeze to harden the ground and give heavy machinery a chance to move into position. There are still battles every day around Bakhmut in the Luhansk region, and some experts say the Russian military is slowly encircling the city, while Ukrainian forces are showing signs of increased activity in the south and east. What this all means in the face of a coming winter freeze is the subject of a new Moscow Times article from correspondent James Beardsworth. James joins us now with an update from the many fronts of the war. Hi, James. Thank you so much for being with us. So many questions about the war. And you have talked to the experts and published this piece. Very interesting. So first thing that I was wondering about is what to expect, actually, on the ground in Ukraine. We understand that winter is coming, but it's not freezing so far. What does this change, actually?
Yeah, well, I think actually right now we find ourselves at an interesting point in the war. We obviously have Russia that looks to be digging in right the way across this long line in the east of Ukraine, as well as in the south. We've seen fortifications being put up around Zaporizhia, as well as also fortifications in mainland Russia in cities like Belgorod. On top of that, Ukraine finds itself in an interesting position where, of course, it's just retaken the city of Kherson, and it finds itself with quite high morale. Russia, on the other hand, kind of wants to see the next few months out. Of course, Russia is still within the throes of its first mobilization wave, which means that it's just starting to send hundreds of thousands of more men to Ukraine, which, of course, Russia is hoping is it's going to be able to sort of dig in and muddle through the winter. I propose that sort of for Ukraine, actually, what they might want to do in the next few months is try to push, whilst the morale is high, as you mentioned, while it's not completely freezing and the weather isn't becoming too much of a problem, to try to fight for positions, which when the spring comes next year, they'll be in a more sort of advantageous position to then launch a wider offensive and look to capture more parts of eastern and southern Ukraine. So do you understand correctly that Russia's main force is the quantity of people on the ground, and this mobilization has shown that it really means something, right? That Ukraine has morale, Russia has quantity of men. Do you expect, and do the experts who you are talking with about this war expect the next wave of mobilization in Russia? Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting question. Obviously, you mentioned there the pure mass of men. I think right now Russia has about 150,000 men training in Belarus. And whilst, of course, we know that many of these men are going to be poorly trained, poorly equipped, of course, their mass counts for something. We're talking about a huge amount of personnel here. I think what Russia is essentially hoping is once it fully sends all of these men to the battlefield, then just by the sheer mass, they will be able to make a difference. Now, you also touch upon there the idea of a second wave of mobilization. I think we're a little bit early to talk about that, and here's why. The first of that is, of course, it were only just months into the first wave of mobilization. Russia is still in the process of training men, and we already know that it's got limited resources in terms of officers and equipment. The second of those is also, I think, due to the fact of what Russia wants to achieve in the next few months. We know that Russia wants to dig in. It wants to use this glut of men to be able to hold its positions. And I think only when the spring comes, the weather turns and Russia finds itself in a position where these men are fully ingested into the armed forces, will it actually then want to go back onto the offensive.
Oh, that's really interesting, because there are Russian experts that we talk with, of course, who insist that the next wave of mobilization will start after January, in the beginning of next year. But my last question is actually about Crimea, the main part of Ukraine, which is, I would say, the most sacral, the most important for Vladimir Putin and his government, and for Russians who believe in this war. So what does Russian government and what do Russian, commanders do to fortify its positions around Crimea?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I think you may have come across in the last week, we've seen satellite imagery of these small concrete pyramids that have been placed right the way across the sort of entrance to Crimea from the north. Of course, it would be a huge symbolic victory for Ukraine to take back Crimea. I would propose that right now, both Russian commanders as well as Ukrainian commanders aren't thinking about this. We, of course, have huge swathes of Kherson on the east bank of the river, as well as almost, I think, 60% of the southern part, the Zaporizhia region, that's still within Russian hands. I think the Ukrainian commanders will be sort of focusing on that, and only once those areas have returned back into the hands of Kiev will Crimea really be on the table.
And you're saying that Russian government does not expect anything serious around Crimea, right?
I would propose that right now, in the short term, absolutely not. Obviously, as we enter in the spring and we see more movement on the battlefield, and whether Russia can actually deploy these mobilized men in an effective way, only then will the Crimea question actually be on the table. Right now, I propose it's not.
All right. Thank you very much for your input.
Russia tomorrow.
1 month ago, the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation designated me as a foreign agent. In a short explanation, they have mentioned that I've been acting in the interests of Ukraine. Obviously, as a Russian journalist, I act in the interests of Russia, as well as my colleagues, other anchors, the founder of TV Rain, Natalia Sindeyeva, and the editor-in-chief, Tikhon Zitko. All of us are officially foreign agents. This means that Russian authorities are trying to demonstrate that we are enemies of the people, agents of the West and Ukraine altogether. They try to make people in Russia stop watching. They have already forced us out of the country. Now they fight us from Moscow, even though we should not be a problem anymore. Well, we obviously are. No one pays attention to this new foreign agents list, perhaps because there are too many. But anyways, thanks for watching, dear Russian government. With more on social changes in Russia since the beginning of Putin's war in Ukraine, we now hear from my TV Rain colleague, Mikhail Fishman.
From the start of Putin's war with Ukraine, scholars and experts across the world have been debating what it represents: a far-right fascist type of action or far-left Stalinism. Similarities are obvious on both accounts. Putin thinks in Stalin's terms. He started the war under the banner of denazification of Ukraine. Translated from Russia's propaganda language, it means desocialization, the deformation of its social structure. As a nation, Ukrainians must be turned into a formless entity that would serve the interests of the state, just as the Soviet people did under Stalin. But Nazism is also present. As the Ukrainian philosopher Vladimir Yermolenko has put it, Putin's views on Ukraine look like inverted Nazism.
Jews were, for Nazis, the other, which wanted to be like you. Ukrainians are, for Russians, like us, which now want to be the other, and therefore have to be exterminated as a major enemy par excellence, anti-Russia.
Perhaps no single historical analogy can fully describe Putin's invasion, but from the very start it was based on totalitarian ideas. The totalitarian mechanism always works the same way. It looks for an enemy group of people in society, whether along social, racial, gender or other lines, and blames them for disrupting the nation from within. With Stalin, it was the counter-revolutionaries. Hitler had the Jews. Putin has the Ukrainians. Even now, propaganda insists that Ukrainians are dividing the Russian people from within.
Only the most naive people would believe that this is the process of becoming a political nation and the formation of a national culture. No, the entire purpose of this is purely the destruction of the Russian people, destruction from within by dividing the nation and pitting those divisions against each other.
In fact, 9 months later, Putin has largely abandoned his story of the denazification of Ukraine. Now he's shelling Ukrainian energy infrastructure, plunging the country into darkness. The Kremlin is as clear as any hostage taker. Volodymyr Zelensky can end the suffering of the Ukrainian people by meeting Putin's demands. In Ukraine, Putin now behaves like a terrorist, but his totalitarian ideas are still driving him forward. The more he is losing the war, the more he aims them inwards. In 2012, the Russian government has introduced the concept of a foreign agent, claiming that it is copying a similar American law. This is a special law initially used for disloyal human rights activists and journalists. For example, almost all my colleagues at TV Rain have been labeled as foreign agents. We have been put in the position of pariahs, personally. But when Nobel laureate Dmitry Muratov asked Putin about this law a year ago, Putin again said that it was being implemented just like in America. It is simple, he said. Money that comes from abroad should be identified as such. No big deal.
Российское общество должно знать, что да, человек вот такую-то позицию формулирует, так-то он относится к внутриполитическим процессам, так еще каким еще, но он получает деньги из-за границы. Это право российского общества. По сути, у нас вот к этому все и сводится. Там ограничений никаких нет.
No restrictions at all, said Putin. Now, fast forward to 1 year later. On December 1st, new laws on foreign agents are coming into force. Daria Korolenko, a lawyer from the independent media project Over the Info, explains what restrictions are being implemented.
The civic organizations that had to submit their tax reports quarterly and not mark them would now have to submit 3 or 4 times more reports and mark everything they write as sourced by a foreign agent. They would also have to face various other restrictions and requirements. All the so-called foreign agents now have a huge amount of restrictions. They can't participate in elections, they can't participate in any kind of education of minors, distribute information in the media, and are banned from a whole range of other activities.
So there are a lot of restrictions. You can't participate in elections, you can't teach, you can't participate in the insurance deposit system. It's a direct and blatant denial of civil rights. And this is the same logic in which the persecution of the Jews in the Third Reich developed. Yes, I know about Godwin's law. Don't bring up Hitler into discussion. But firstly, after Putin started the war, Godwin himself admitted he lost. Secondly, Russian foreign agent legislation bluntly duplicates Nazis' race laws, right down to the details. It's like they copied it. For example, foreign agents are now banned from holding positions in power and in military service, much like the National Socialists banned Jews from civil service in April 1933, just 2 months after they came to power. They used the special law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which applied not only to Jews, but also, for example, to members of the Communist Party and other untrustworthy elements. And just as the Nazis began to persecute homosexuals when they came to power, the Kremlin is tightening the so-called gay propaganda law. In response to the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who urged via Twitter to not pass this homophobic legislation, the members of the Russian parliament voted unanimously.
Покажите, пожалуйста, результат. За 397, против нет, воздержавшихся нет. Коллеги, поздравляем. А господину госсекретарю Блинкину это лучший ответ. Не надо нам навязывать чуждые ценности. Вы свои разрушили, посмотрим, чем это все закончится. Но однозначно печально, потому что это Содом, по-другому не скажешь. И Соединенные Штаты Америки стали центром этого Содома в мире.
And state propagandists have been reinforcing the necessity of this law with reports from the World Cup in Qatar, declaring that the liberal West is trying to push gender diversity and sexual freedom on them too, as if Russia is Qatar. Whether the World Cup should be held in a place where same-sex relations are punishable by prison is a separate question. But Russia is not an Islamic country. It has no Sharia law. Russia is historically part of Europe. Yes, it is more conservative than the Netherlands or Norway, but it does not live inside the strictest religious prohibitions. This is an objective reality. According to polls 20 years ago, in 2003, when asked about their attitude towards homosexuals, 45% answered they had no problem with it. By February 2013, this number had dropped to 23%, largely as a result of state propaganda. In 2005, only 35% of Russians opposed gay rights. 16 years later, it was almost twice as much already. Putin tells us that Russia is a unique civilization. But the truth is that homophobia is not a traditional attitude in Russia. It was imposed by the Kremlin. And now for the government, it is a symbol of breaking with the West. Otherwise, it is unclear why Putin started his bloody war. This is how Putin phrased it at a recent meeting with the mothers of the mobilized.
На рубеже 2000-х, 90-х годов нам казалось, что все будет хорошо, а оказалось, что это совсем не так. И больше того, мы начали как бы жить и играть на какой-то чужой поляне. И с восторгом предавались тому, что нами пытаются управлять. И в конечном итоге те, кто пытался нами управлять, в общем-то и целом, благодаря их усилиям мы оказались в той ситуации, в том числе и вот в зоне специальной военной операции. Ведь же они до этого довели.
And this is exactly the same lines of logic down which the persecution of gay people in Nazi Germany developed. For Hitler, the free, liberal, cosmopolitan times of the Weimar Republic were his German 90s, when the great Aryan civilization began to play on an alien playing field, dancing to someone else's tune. In Russia, the first law banning gay propaganda appeared in 2013, at the same time as the first law on foreign agents. Back then, it banned propaganda targeting children. Now, it has been extended to everyone. The Nazis did not immediately put gay people in concentration camps either. They also started with shielding children from homosexual propaganda and closing gay clubs. But in 1937, Himmler stated that this plague could not be present in SS, as homosexuality was detrimental to the birth rate and threatened Germany with a demographic catastrophe, an argument Putin would also use. Exactly as the initial anti-gay legislation, Putin needs this new, updated version primarily for PR purposes, to cover up his defeat in Ukraine. It is not he who has attacked Ukraine. It is the West who is destroying Russia from within with its liberal values. As experts point out, the new bans are virtually the same as the old ones. Some movies might be banned, some books too. Streaming platforms might remove LGBTQ content from their platforms. But most importantly, the nation is being pointed at the internal enemy. A new tool for repression and settling scores will be at display. There will be more violence, says Gulia Sultanova, organizer of the Bokobok LGBTQ festival.
Before, people who were violated were afraid to go to the police. That is, they did not feel confident and entitled to ask for protection from the so-called law enforcement officers then. Even more so now. In principle, any crimes against LGBTQ people can be justified, not necessarily sexual violence, but any kind of attack. LGBTQ people have become so vulnerable that anyone could write a complaint that threatens to send an LGBTQ person to jail for propaganda, because no one understands what propaganda exactly is. There is no such thing as LGBT propaganda. It's just some fiction, it's simulacra, it's all bullshit.
The new law is not even in effect yet, but this is exactly what is beginning to happen. LGBTQ people The new law is not even in effect yet, but this is exactly what is beginning to happen. LGBTQ people are already being harassed in Telegram feeds across social media. Why is there a transgender person sitting on this expert panel? Who let him in? Gays need medical treatment, says a member of Russian parliament.
Мальчик должен выглядеть как мальчик, девочка должна выглядеть как девочка. И если у тебя есть заболевание, его надо лечить, а не хвастаться этим. То есть не говорить, смотрите, у меня вот тут зуб кариозный, да, тут печень не работает. Поэтому вот мальчик как мальчик, девочка как девочка.
Putin is using homophobia for political purposes, but the truth is that he is not in control anymore. He has lost the war and has been swept up in the current. He is trying to survive by covering himself with repressive legislation and pointing society at a supposed internal enemy. Nobody knows what will happen tomorrow, neither Putin nor his officials. And at the same time, Russia is turning into a fascist state, just like Germany in the 1930s.
Russia tomorrow.
European Union sanctions on Russian oil are hard to understand and even harder to implement. Nobody wants an energy crisis. Nobody wants to see oil prices skyrocketing and reaching record limits. Yet neither the EU nor the G7 are willing to pay the Kremlin as much as $10 billion monthly, while its army is killing Ukrainian people. So in October, European countries agreed on a new pack of economic sanctions to weaken Vladimir Putin's war fund. The countries agreed to cap the purchase price on Russian oil from the beginning of December. They also created an enforcement mechanism to ban insurance and financial services for seaborne tankers that carry any Russian oil that costs more than the price cap. That means that oil cargoes without insurance or with insurance from smaller, less financially strong groups would fail to gain access to shipping companies, ports and canals. European Commissioner for Energy Kadri Simpson says the EU ban on Russian oil will take place on December 5th, and all that remains to discuss is a price cap for third country oil customers.
Our sanctions against Russian crude oil will start by 5th of December. So after 5th of December, EU 27 member states will not buy Russian seaborne crude oil anymore. And these discussions with our partners at the G7 format to introduce a price cap for seaborne oil are targeting the third countries who are still buying Russian oil. And if they want to use our vessels, our tankers, and transport it, they have to request that Russia sells them the oil at a significant discount. And these discussions of this exact price level are still ongoing. But I hope that they will be in place very soon.
Turkey, for example, has agreed that no Russian oil cargoes will pass from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean without this insurance. With more than 90% of the world's ships insured via London's international group, the new measures mean an embargo on Russian oil. In response, Russia threatens to stop selling oil to anyone who complies with the sanctions. Analysts and experts say that Russian counter-sanction could severely cripple the Kremlin's single largest income stream, as well as send the global oil price to nearly $200 per barrel. This is because oil is a highly interconnected global commodity, not just a Russian cash machine, and the global price per barrel moves up and down every day in electronic trading. Russia is the world's third largest oil producer after the United States and Saudi Arabia, pumping around 11 million barrels daily from its enormous reserves. Up until the February invasion of Ukraine, Russia was also the world's largest oil exporter. Since June, in anticipation of the December 5th deadline, European markets and other Western nations began to cut their reliance on Russia by shifting to crude oil from the United States, West Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Experts believe that Russia's prime cost for 1 barrel of oil is around $40. Everything above that is profit. As time is running out, Poland, Estonia and Lithuania are pushing the EU for a lower price limit at around $30 per barrel. $30 a barrel for Russian oil would be unprofitable and effectively punish Vladimir Putin for his war, which is what Warsaw, Tallinn and Vilnius aim to achieve. But others at the EU are much more cautious. European Commissioner for Energy Simpson says current sanctions are already working on the Russian crude oil trade and that more plans are on the way to diversify away from Russian refined oil products and natural gas.
I can respond on behalf of EU27, but of course there are other buyers globally. And now when we are discussing this current oil ban, then this is to secure that Russia will not earn unfair four-time premiums from the third country buyers neither. From our side, we have put into place several sanctions, and these are already impacting Russia's ability to produce gas and oil. So compared to their ability to produce oil and gas a year ago, they have lost volume significantly already, and this trend continues for the next years. From our side, we have made a commitment that we will not buy Russian oil products. We don't have in place sanctions against Russian natural gas, but we have in place a strategy how we will replace it. So we will diversify our supplies, we will cut our demand, and we have done so already. And then on top of that, where we can, we will replace natural gas with renewables. So where we can, we will electrify, and keeping in mind that that 40% of our gas consumption is due to the heating, then promoting heat pumps instead of individual gas boilers is our way forward to get rid of this dangerous dependency.
This has been Russia Tomorrow, a production of TV Rain. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our English language YouTube channel, TV Rain Newsroom. You can help contribute to our efforts with a donation to our GoFundMe page in the description below. I am Ekaterina Katrikadze. Thanks for watching and see you soon.